There is nothing quite as unromantic as a chicken watching you try to be romantic. Hey friends, tonight we begin with a subject that is at once scandalous, scholarly, and strangely soothing. The kind of topic that might make your high school history teacher blush and your medieval priest reach for his sermon book. We're stepping into the intimate, confusing, and often downright absurd world of medieval sex. A world where privacy was rare, romance was regulated, and foreplay might have been as simple as asking politely and hoping no one else was in the bed. But before we slip into the past, take a moment to gently like the video and subscribe, but only if you enjoy what we do here. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's falling asleep around the world with a little bit of history in their ears. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft, steady hum in the background. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's begin with the biggest myth of all. We tend to imagine medieval romance unfolding beneath silk sheets, candlelight flickering, a lute playing softly in the background, two lovers whispering secrets in Latin. But that fantasy couldn't be further from reality, because in most medieval homes, there were no silk sheets. There was no candlelight, because tallow was expensive and wax was a luxury. There was no privacy, and the room was never empty. Most people, especially peasants, lived in single-room homes. No upstairs, no separate bedroom, no lock on the door. The space where you cooked your meals, said your prayers, gave birth, and tried to share a moment of affection was the same space that housed the entire family. Children, parents, aging grandparents, a goat or two, maybe a pig, definitely a chicken. And sometimes the chicken had opinions. Beds, when they existed, were shared. Straw mattresses, if you were lucky, a rough wooden frame if you were wealthy, or a simple blanket near the fire if you weren't. Curtains were a luxury, not a privacy solution. And even those were more for warmth than modesty. If a couple wanted to be alone, they had to get creative. They'd wait until the children were asleep, or at least pretending to be. They'd hope the in-laws were snoring, and they'd whisper so quietly, not out of romance, but because gossip moved faster than the plague. In noble households, things weren't much better. Yes, the rooms were larger. Yes, the beds had canopies, but servants were often asleep on the floor, or tucked near the fire. Scribes, guards, wet nurses, chambermaids, all hovering just out of sight, or not out of sight at all. Even kings were rarely truly alone. There are records of noble families keeping detailed logs of who slept where and with whom, not for posterity, but for legality, and perhaps a touch of surveillance. Privacy, in the modern sense, doors closed, walls thick, time uninterrupted, simply did not exist, even if you were rich. Especially if you weren't. Travel made things even worse. Inns were scarce, and shared beds were normal. You might find yourself curled up next to a stranger who had strong body odor and stronger opinions about which direction was his side. Want a little affection while on the road? You'd better check twice, once for roommates and once for who brought boots into bed. In some parts of Europe, entire families might sleep together for warmth. One mattress, one blanket, many feet. The only thing separating husband and wife from the rest of the house might be a soft prayer and a sturdy sense of denial Still, people made do. Love, desire, connection, they found cracks in the architecture. Little spaces of stillness, fleeting as they were. Maybe under the stars, behind a haystack, or during a particularly loud thunderstorm. And sometimes in the garden. Why gardens? Because many convents and monasteries had unusually high garden walls. And where there are high walls, there are secrets. In medieval Europe, privacy was a rare and precious thing, rarer even than good bread or dry firewood. But for those seeking affection, privacy wasn't just a luxury. It was a tactical operation. Because the truth is, if you wanted to be close to someone, you needed not just desire, but timing, silence, luck, and sometimes livestock cooperation. Let's say you were married, and let's also assume, and this is important, that you were both still awake, reasonably clean, and in agreement. Even under these best-case conditions, finding a moment of intimacy was like threading a needle in a windstorm. Because the medieval home was not your home. It was cold. It was crowded. And the walls were made of wattle and daub, a fancy way of saying sticks, mud, and disappointment. Sound traveled. And so did gossip. There are surviving legal records of couples trying to coordinate their affections with astonishing strategy. One woman confessed that she and her husband only had relations when the pig had been fed, the soup was on, and the wind was blowing away from the neighbor's house. Another man claimed he once disguised his wife's soft moans as a bout of coughing because his brother was sleeping 2 feet away. We cannot confirm if the brother believed it. Upper-class intimacy was no less complicated. If you lived in a manor, you might have a private chamber, but not a private moment. Servants were everywhere, and they didn't go home at night. They slept on pallets on the floor, or behind tapestries, or at the foot of the bed, depending on your social rank and their loyalty. Imagine trying to ignite passion with a scribe sitting nearby, copying inventory lists, or a handmaid pretending very hard not to notice that the bed was creaking to the rhythm of the liturgical calendar. Some noble families even kept written records of which servant slept where, and more awkwardly, which couple was scheduled to sleep together. These documents weren't meant to be romantic. They were legal protection, in case a child's parentage came into question later. Romance, wrapped in a scroll of bureaucracy. For the average person, though, there were more practical concerns. Mostly, where to do it. And when. Because if your children were still awake, or your mother-in-law was watching, or the firewood was too low, and you couldn't be under the blanket without shivering, then the moment passed. And let's be honest, it might not return for a while. Many homes had only one bed, or no bed at all. Some couples made do with straw bundles, shared with babies, toddlers, or aging parents. There was no turning on soft music, no candle-lit ambiance, and no guaranteed alone time. Even locking a door was a novelty. Most doors latched from the outside, if they latched at all. So what did people do? They adapted. Some waited until early morning, when others were still asleep. Some used festivals and church holidays as cover, louder crowds, drunk neighbors, distracted clergy. And some didn't wait at all. The barn, the woods, the stream all became romantic if you squinted and ignored the frostbite. Even the church acknowledged these realities. In confession manuals, certain locations were mentioned not as warnings, but as probable occurrences. Near the grain sacks, beside the fence line, in the tool shed, but only after Vespers. The church may not have approved, but it certainly understood. Still, discretion remained crucial. Because while the physical logistics were difficult, the social logistics were harder. One misstep, one creaking board at the wrong moment, one whispered word caught by an ant with good hearing, and your reputation could suffer. This is why quietness appears so frequently in medieval discussions of intimacy, not just as a virtue, but as a survival strategy. Silence wasn't romantic. It was protective. Noise could cost you. For unmarried couples, it could mean a fine. For married ones, a scandal. For clergy, well, let's just say some monks didn't stay monks. Let's turn for a moment to travel. Because if staying at home was difficult, staying away from home was almost impossible. Medieval inns were nothing like the ones you're imagining. There was no room service, no locking door, and no guarantee of a bed to yourself. It was common, even expected, that travelers would share beds with strangers. This practice was known as bed sharing or double bedding, and it had less to do with affection than with heat conservation. Multiple bodies meant a warmer night, and in a world without insulation, you took what warmth you could get. Some records show total strangers sleeping side by side, boots off, bodies curled like question marks. If someone joined the bed late, they might tap your shoulder or simply lie down. It wasn't always polite to ask questions. This created complications. If you were traveling with your spouse and hoped for an intimate moment, you might first have to ask, "Excuse me, is this bed full? Do you mind facing the wall? Are you asleep yet? Also, please ignore any noises. They're all ecclesiastically approved." The tension between opportunity and observation shaped everything. People didn't expect to be alone. They hoped to be unnoticed. There's a difference. And the fear wasn't always the church. Often, it was your neighbors. In tightly knit medieval communities, everyone knew everything. If you lit a candle at an odd hour, if the dog barked for too long outside your door, if you seemed especially cheerful at Mass the next morning, someone would talk. Gossip was faster than fire and nearly as destructive. A misplaced smile or disheveled tunic could turn into a village tale that lingered for weeks. And if your local priest caught wind of it, the consequences might include public penance, or worse, mandatory confession with extra questions. So much of medieval intimacy was about navigating observation, not passion, not romance, just getting from one touch to another without being seen. Let's not forget the monasteries and convents. On paper, these were places of absolute celibacy. No touching, no late-night visits, no indulgence, whispered or otherwise. But humans are humans, even in robes. And while many monks and nuns lived faithfully according to their vows, others found moments. High garden walls, shared scripture, a knowing glance during Vespers. Some convents were known for having gardens that doubled as quiet meeting spots. Others had confessors who spent unusual amounts of time with certain sisters. And in more than a few abbeys, there were scandals. Letters found, children born, vows broken or rewritten. In fact, Some of the most passionate surviving letters of the Middle Ages come from clergy to clergy, monks to monks, nuns to nuns, speaking in spiritual metaphors that occasionally slipped into something far more tender. These stories are often omitted from the more pious versions of medieval history. But they were there, just quiet, just carefully tucked under the heavy blankets of devotion. Because in a world where nothing was private, where walls were thin and beds were shared, and even love needed a schedule, people still found ways to kiss behind a curtain, to hold hands when the light was low, to fall asleep shoulder to shoulder while pretending nothing had happened. Intimacy wasn't easy. It wasn't spontaneous. It wasn't always soft music and soft lighting. But it happened, not because the world allowed it, but because people found quiet pockets inside the noise. Monasteries and convents were meant to be sanctuaries, islands of silence, devotion, and pure, uninterrupted prayer. At least, that was the idea. In reality, even behind cloistered gates and beneath vaulted ceilings, human nature didn't go away. It just learned to whisper. From the outside, these sacred spaces seemed impenetrable. Stone walls, heavy doors, strict rules about eye contact, movement, even speech. Some monasteries were so strict, monks weren't allowed to speak outside designated hours. They communicated through hand signs, simple gestures, for water, for bread, for silence, but never for longing, never for love. And yet, even silence has its loopholes. Somewhere between the chants and the chores, between the psalms and the peeling of root vegetables, people still noticed each other. They noticed how Brother Thomas's eyes lingered just a little too long on Brother Gabriel during evening prayer, or how Sister Agnes found excuses to help Sister Clara with her garden tools that were stored on the opposite side of the convent. These weren't just spiritual partnerships. They were something else, something softer, riskier, and very, very quiet. Let's be clear. Monastic life was demanding. People didn't join lightly. Most monks and nuns were deeply devout, and many lived their entire lives without breaking a single vow. But others struggled with loneliness, with memory, with bodies that didn't quite forget the outside world. Take Brother Eustace of Norwich. His letters, preserved in brittle parchment and even more brittle Latin, are filled with lines that sound like poetry. I see the light on his face and feel the weight of my sin. I pray not for forgiveness, but for peace. I cannot tell the difference. These weren't lines about heresy. They were about affection. Quiet, confused, entirely human affection. In some convents, love grew in the most hidden places. Gardens, for example. High-walled, carefully tended, gardens were sacred in both a religious and a romantic sense. They provided herbs for medicine, solitude for prayer, and, on rare occasions, a safe place to kiss. There are recorded punishments in church archives, vague references to improprieties behind the rosemary, or shadows near the apple trees. One nun, Sister Magdalena, was scolded for excessive fondness of the garden and its keeper. The keeper, of course, was another nun. The church responded as it usually did, with rules, more supervision, more penance, more walls. Some abbeys began assigning garden time in pairs, but only pairs approved by the abbess. Others removed benches entirely, hoping that discomfort would discourage lingering. But love doesn't care about benches, or timetables, or what the abbess thinks. In a few rare cases, forbidden affection escalated into scandal. One monk, in the 14th century, was caught sneaking across the boundary wall into the adjacent convent. He was wearing a cloak 2 sizes too small and carrying what can only be described as a late-night prayer kit. When confronted, he claimed he was delivering scripture. No one believed him. The punishment? Public confession, flogging, and permanent reassignment to a monastery in the north. Far in the north, where the walls were high, the rooms were cold, and the chances of meeting a lonely nun were close to 0. But not all affections were punished. Some were simply overlooked, tolerated by kindly superiors who believed that love, even when inconvenient, was better than despair. There's a story, half record, half legend, of 2 monks who spent their whole lives in the same monastery. They took vows together. They copied scripture together. They were buried side by side. And in the margins of a shared prayer book, their initials are carved, small, simple, and surrounded by hearts. The archivist who cataloged the book centuries later wrote, "It is not for us to judge the shape of their prayer." Now, to be fair, some monastic infractions were less romantic and more practical. There were tales of young novices caught with lovers from the nearby village, of late-night escapades that involved ropes, windows, and very sore ankles, of candles being borrowed and not for reading scripture. In one case, a nun was discovered pregnant and claimed divine conception. The abbess, unimpressed, said, "The Lord does not favor midnight strolls with the stable boy." Her penance? 30 days of fasting, and no more stable duty. But there's something deeper here, something more than scandal or sin. Monasteries and convents weren't just about suppression. They were about structure, about focus. And for many people, those sacred spaces freed them from the chaos of the outside world, especially women. For noble daughters, joining a convent was often a way to escape an arranged marriage, to live in relative peace, to read, to write, to govern something, even if it was only a herb garden, and sometimes to love, quietly. Church authorities knew this, and they walked a fine line between spiritual discipline and practical reality. They issued rules like no speaking after sundown, no visiting cells unaccompanied, no soft-touching, emotional letters or lingering looks. They might as well have posted a sign, "No being human." Of course, these rules were not always followed, and not always enforced. Priors, abbesses, and bishops had discretion, and not all were cruel. Some saw love as a test, others as a weakness, and a few as a sacred thing, misdirected but still sincere. Not all forbidden affection in monasteries was same-sex either. Some came from outside. Merchants who flirted with nuns through the bakery window, pilgrims who developed sudden spiritual devotion near the convent gates, musicians who played a little longer than necessary beneath the bell tower. In a few rare cases, marriages emerged from these meetings, with permission from the church. and often after much paperwork. But more often, these flirtations ended in silence, in longing, or in one final note slipped under a cloister door. Despite the structure, the vows, and the walls, monastic life was still human life. Lonely, joyful, mundane, sacred, and occasionally ridiculous. Monks argued about chores. Nuns borrowed things without asking. And somewhere, beneath layers of rules and robes, hearts still beat. Even the church, in its quieter texts, occasionally softened. There are letters from bishops acknowledging affection between monastics, not celebrating it, but neither condemning it with fire and fury. One bishop wrote, "If their hearts remain in prayer, we may trust God to sort the rest." It's tempting to see monasteries as prisons, as places where desire was crushed under stone in Scripture, but for many, they were havens, places of learning, of healing, of friendship that became something more, even if that something had no name. So, when you picture medieval love, don't just imagine the hayloft, or the noble bedroom, or the crowded peasant home. Picture the cloister walk at twilight. Two figures passing each other in silence. A glance, a brush of hands, a heartbeat in a garden. Because even behind the thickest walls, even in the holiest silence, the soul still longed to be touched. If you were a married couple in medieval Europe and hoped to share a little affection with your spouse, you needed more than desire. You needed a calendar. A very specific calendar, approved by the church and marked with all the days on which sex was strictly forbidden. And it wasn't just Sundays, or feast days, or Lent. It was nearly everything. The church, in all its holy wisdom, declared over half the year off limits for marital intimacy. Let that sink in. Out of 365 days, you are prohibited on something like 250 of them, sometimes more, sometimes less, depending on your region, your local bishop, and how literally your priest took the rules. There were restrictions during Lent, of course. Advent, naturally. The week before Easter, the week after Easter, the day before a feast, the feast itself, and the day after. Mondays were discouraged because they began the work week. Fridays were out, too holy. Saturdays were iffy, a day of preparation. Wednesdays, a gray area. And Sundays were the Lord's Day, so obviously no. Which left, at best, Tuesdays. Maybe, if there wasn't a saint's feast, or a fast, or an eclipse. Imagine planning romance with that in mind. Sorry, darling, the moon looks too holy tonight. Or, I long for you, but the bishop's cousin just got canonized. To be clear, this wasn't just about rules. It was about souls. The church believed that sex was a necessary part of marriage, but also a dangerous, slippery path. It had to be managed, measured, directed toward one goal only: procreation. Pleasure for its own sake was viewed as indulgent at best, sinful at worst. Even within marriage, priests often advised couples to pray before intercourse, to ask for forgiveness after, and to avoid smiling during. Yes, smiling was discouraged. It sounds absurd now, but to the medieval mind, the body and the soul were locked in constant tension. Desire wasn't just a personal emotion, it was a spiritual threat, a temptation to fall from grace, a crack through which the devil might crawl. So the church did what it often did in the face of chaos. It made a schedule, a deeply impractical, theologically anxious, often contradictory schedule, but a schedule nonetheless. Sex was forbidden on feast days, on days before feast days, on days after feast days, during Lent, during Advent, on Fridays because of the crucifixion, on Sundays because of the resurrection, before receiving communion, after receiving communion, and sometimes just because a local priest said so. The result was a spiritual minefield. Couples were constantly second-guessing themselves. Is tonight okay? Did St. Bartholomew die today? Is it a vigil? A fast? A holy octave? And remember, most peasants couldn't read. So these rules had to be memorized, passed down, interpreted by village clergy who may or may not have gotten it right themselves. Some tried to simplify things. A few priests advised their congregants to keep a personal chart. Others suggested avoiding all uncertain days just to be safe, which meant, effectively, most of the year. Still, people found ways. One popular workaround was the "I was asleep" defense. If a married couple accidentally became intimate during the night, in their sleep, and one or both weren't fully conscious, then maybe it didn't count. A monk named Peter of Verona once ruled that an unconscious stirring of marital union was not sinful, but only if both parties were truly unaware. How that was verified remains a mystery. Then there was the matter of intent. If a couple intended to procreate, not for pleasure, not for bonding, not because it was raining and there was nothing else to do, then the act was considered spiritually cleaner, more acceptable, more worthy. Some clergy even advised reciting psalms during the act, to focus the mind, to prevent wandering thoughts, to keep the spirit fixed on God, even while the body was otherwise engaged. Now, did people actually do this? Probably not. But it says something about the world they lived in, a world where desire had to be justified, even to heaven. There's a remarkable story from a 13th century sermon collection about a man who confessed to his priest that he had enjoyed himself with his wife during Lent. The priest, aghast, ordered him to fast for 2 weeks and sleep in the barn. The man agreed, but only after checking the barn wasn't occupied by his other wife. The church had rules, but the people had loopholes. And yet, for all its restrictions, the church also provided structure, predictability, a rhythm to the year, from fasting to feasting, from abstinence to indulgence. There were even designated marriage seasons, times of year when weddings were encouraged, and therefore other things were allowed to follow. Spring and summer, in particular, saw more weddings, because that meant more daylight, and more daylight meant fewer candle costs. Yes, even romance had a budget. Weddings, once approved, came with instructions. The couple must be married in a church, by a priest, in front of witnesses, without coercion, and with a clear understanding of their marital duties. which usually meant a quiet side conversation about when they were, and were not, allowed to be together. This conversation wasn't optional. It was called the churching of marriage, and it often included a brief, incredibly awkward explanation of the calendar. Some priests used visual aids. Others relied on hand gestures. Some skipped the whole thing entirely and just muttered, "Only Tuesdays, maybe." Not everyone followed the rules. In fact, most didn't. Private letters, court records, and confession manuals are full of quiet disobedience. Late-night visits, furtive touches, couples whispering across the fire at midnight, deciding together to risk it. Sometimes they were caught and punished, but more often they were simply ignored, because priests, too, were human, and in many small villages, they were also the local baker, judge, or cousin. So while official doctrine frowned upon pleasure, real life tolerated it. In small, sleepy towns, a wink could carry more authority than a papal decree. What's fascinating is how internalized all this became. There are surviving prayer journals where devout men and women recorded guilt not just for desire, but for the thought of desire, for a dream, a glance, a smile that lingered too long. Some confessions were painfully detailed. I felt the devil rise in my chest when she brushed my hand at market. I remembered her laugh as I stirred the soup and knew I had sinned. I woke with sweat and prayed for the frost to cool me. And yet, there are also notes of joy, of laughter, of couples who held hands under blankets and whispered psalms not as penance, but as poetry. So much of medieval love was negotiated between the sacred and the ordinary, between the church's long list of forbidden days and the simple need to be close to someone, to feel warm, to feel seen. And somehow, it still happened. Not because it was allowed, but because it was needed. Even if you had to wait until Tuesday. In April, after the feast of Saint Simon, as long as he wasn't your patron saint, and the moon wasn't too full, and the bishop wasn't visiting, and you remembered to pray. Twice, with feeling. The medieval church didn't just care when you had sex. It cared how you had it, and why, and what you were thinking about at the time. If this seems oddly specific, that's because it was. Very specific. Enter the confession manuals, dense, solemn, often shockingly detailed books written to help priests question their flock. These weren't casual guides. They were the spiritual equivalent of a compliance checklist meant to root out not only sinful actions, but sinful thoughts, intentions, and emotions. And nowhere was the church's anxiety more obvious than in the section labeled, often in Latin, de fornicatione. On the matter of fornication, these manuals went into extraordinary, almost clinical detail. They outlined different types of sexual sin: adultery, incest, lustful gazes, touching with intent, touching without intent but with possible temptation, and even the sin of remembering something too fondly. Confessors were instructed to ask questions, very direct questions. Questions that might make a modern therapist blush. Did you lie with your wife during Lent? Was your intention pleasure or procreation? Did you imagine another person in your heart while engaged in the act? Were you above or below? That last one wasn't a joke. According to some church authorities, the missionary position was the only acceptable option. Anything else was unnatural, suspicious, possibly demonic. One 13th century manual explained that lying with your spouse, as beasts do, that is, from behind, was a sin requiring 3 days of fasting and a full confession. Another warned that the woman on top position gave her symbolic dominance over the man, which disrupted the spiritual hierarchy of marriage. It wasn't just about bodies. It was about cosmic order. Pleasure was especially risky. If a man finished the act with joy, but without thought of God, that was cause for confession. If a woman expressed desire, even toward her own husband, that too required absolution. One manual even claimed that too much laughter before or after could suggest carnal delight, which might stain the soul. Yes, laughter was a red flag. It's easy to find this ridiculous now, but to many medieval believers, this was serious business. Salvation wasn't a vague concept. It was the fragile balance of obedience, confession, and forgiveness. And sex, well, sex was the part most likely to throw everything off. The idea was this: you could commit a sinful act, knowingly or not, and unless you named that sin and repented for it properly, your soul remained in danger, even within a lawful marriage, even if no one else knew. So confession became both a relief and a risk, a place to unburden, and a place where the priest would lean in and ask, "How often? With what intention? Did you enjoy it? Did you think of anyone else? Was there movement? Was it prolonged?" It was thorough. Some confessors took this duty seriously, others far too seriously. There are surviving letters from bishops warning priests not to ask unnecessary detail, especially from young women. Apparently, a few confessors were using the manuals as permission to linger on certain topics. The bishops were, understandably, concerned. But the manuals kept coming, and they kept expanding. By the 14th century, some confession books included diagrams, metaphorical ones, but still, they offered guidance on how to phrase your questions, how to assess sincerity, and how to prescribe appropriate penance based on exact circumstances. For instance, intercourse on a fast day, 1 week of fasting; on a feast day, 2 weeks; facing east instead of west during the act, that was a symbolic error; using unnatural devices or substances, 3 weeks penance and a donation; enjoying it too much, too often, fasting and no meat for a month. To make things even more confusing, the rules varied by region. What was a venial sin in France might be mortal in England. A tolerated custom in Italy might be scandalous in Germany. So you had to keep track not only of your desires, but also of your jurisdiction. Still, ordinary people did their best. They confessed. They fasted. They made awkward eye contact with their priest while describing something they'd rather forget, and they went back to their lives, hopefully with a cleaner soul. And yet, despite all the regulation, the manuals never quite eliminated human desire. If anything, they documented it, preserved it, made it part of the written record. Historians now use these texts to understand what people did, what they feared, and what they hoped to hide. Confession was never just about sin. It was about the shape of daily life, the things you thought about when no one was watching, which makes them fascinating. And, sometimes, heartbreakingly honest. One record describes a woman who confessed to dreaming of her husband too fondly. She hadn't acted on it. She hadn't said anything aloud. But she felt the dream was sinful and wanted forgiveness. The priest gave her 3 Hail Marys and a long silence. Another man admitted that he had no desire for his wife, that he completed his duty with prayer but no joy. He was ashamed, not for the lack of lust, but for the absence of love. Confession, at its best, could be a place of grace, a place where people brought not only their guilt, but their loneliness. But more often, it was a maze, a spiritual obstacle course, full of rules you didn't quite understand, administered by someone who might have their own complicated history. Because, of course, many priests were not celibate. Technically, yes, they were supposed to be. But in practice, the rules were often bent, or ignored, or redirected. In some areas, priests openly kept concubines, women known in the community, living in church-owned homes, raising children who were officially no one's capper. Church authorities tried to crack down. They passed reforms, held councils, declared that priests must live pure, chaste lives, and many did, but not all. So when a peasant woman walked into confession and was asked to describe, in vivid detail, the location of her hands during her last encounter with her husband, there was always a bit of tension. Did the priest ask from duty, from curiosity, from habit, or something else? We'll never know. But it's no wonder people got creative. Some simply lied. They confessed to safe sins, the ones everyone had. They avoided details. They said, "It happened," and left it at that. Others used proxy confessions, claiming to describe a friend's mistake or a cousin's accident. "Not me, Father, but someone I know." And some stopped going altogether, especially in later centuries, when people began to read Scripture for themselves and question whether God really cared, what direction they were facing in bed. But in the height of the medieval church's power, the manuals ruled, and they left behind a strange, revealing portrait, not of saints or kings, but of ordinary people trying to be good and failing and trying again. A young couple hoping their timing was right. A farmer praying away a fantasy. A widow confessing to a memory. All wondering if they had sinned, not because they harmed someone, but because they had felt something, wanted something, even for a moment. In the Middle Ages, a sermon wasn't just something you heard on Sunday. It was a mirror held up to your life, polished with Scripture, and framed by your priest's best intentions or worst fears. And sometimes, if you listened closely, you could tell when that mirror was pointed directly at you. The medieval church didn't simply regulate sexuality through doctrine. It preached it, loudly, and often, from wooden pulpits beneath vaulted ceilings, and sometimes in the middle of town squares with extra emphasis and a very loud bell. Sexual morality wasn't private business, it was public concern, and sermons were how that concern was broadcast. A parish priest might spend 10 minutes discussing envy and 30 on immodest behavior in marital settings. Not just fornication, but timing, tone, intention, posture, facial expressions, and noises. In some towns, everyone knew exactly who the priest was talking about. A wife who smiled too warmly, a couple who closed their shutters too early, a young man who'd been seen whistling near the convent wall. He wasn't named, but he felt named, and so did everyone else. Because in medieval communities, where lives were close and walls were thin, sermons didn't float overhead like mist. They landed directly, heavy as bricks. But beyond the sermons themselves, there was the structure behind them, the hierarchy, the system. Priests watched their flocks, and bishops watched their priests. And Rome, well, Rome watched everyone. Or tried to. In small villages, the local priest was often the only literate person for miles. He acted as confessor, teacher, moral guide, dispute settler, and sometimes marriage counselor. If a man was too enthusiastic, or a woman was too distracted, it was the priest's job to ask why, and often to prescribe a solution. These solutions could be strange. One priest advised a newlywed couple to sleep in separate beds for a full year to build holiness through longing. Another ordered a husband to recite a psalm between each movement, a rule which, while difficult, did result in deep scriptural knowledge. Sometimes, enforcement became public, very public. Public penance was one of the church's favorite tools. If someone was caught in sexual sin, especially adultery, premarital intimacy, or clerical misconduct, they might be forced to kneel at the church door, barefoot, in a sackcloth robe, while the townspeople walked past them on Sunday. For hours or days, depending on the offense and the priest's mood. The idea wasn't just punishment, it was shame as theater, to warn others, to reassert moral control, to ensure no one mistook forgiveness for indulgence. And it worked, not because people suddenly became saints, but because they didn't want to be the next one holding a candle and weeping by the church steps. Even in marriage, people lived with that tension. They knew the rules. They heard them every week. Some internalized them. Others quietly ignored them. But all of them lived beneath the echo of the sermon. The words didn't stay in the church. They followed you home, into the kitchen, into the bedroom, into the moments you might have wanted to feel something soft, but instead remembered something stern. Some couples coped by separating their faith from their affection. They prayed together and loved each other separately. Others brought their faith into the act. There are records of couples reciting psalms together before lying down. Some whispered prayers as they held each other. A few left space for an angel, not metaphorically, but literally, leaving a small pillow between them as a sign of spiritual restraint. One particularly devout husband insisted on keeping an icon of the Virgin Mary in the room at all times, turned toward the wall, of course, during private moments, out of respect. Then there were those who negotiated, who loved each other the way they wanted to, and confessed the way the church expected them to. A balance, a rhythm, a way of keeping peace both in heaven and at home. Still, the pressure lingered, not just from sermons, but from the architecture of the church itself. Cathedrals were built to make people feel small. Their ceilings soared, their walls whispered, their echoes stretched past the candles and into your conscience. A wedding wasn't just a ceremony. It was a moral contract, conducted in front of family, neighbors, saints, and sometimes the bishop himself. And afterward, you were expected to follow the rules. The ones written in dusty canon law, and the ones spoken in sermons. To be chaste when told, obedient when asked, available when required, and never, ever joyful in the wrong way. But even priests knew that people struggled, that the body had its own language, that sometimes love didn't obey rules. It moved awkwardly, messily, sweetly. It didn't read the calendar or remember the feast days. Some confessors, quietly, made allowances. They shortened penance. They softened their tone. They quoted Christ's mercy instead of the bishop's list. There's a story from 14th century Bavaria about a woman who confessed to kissing her husband on the mouth during Lent. She wept. She begged. The priest, after a long silence, told her, "Love is not your enemy. Just let it rest on holy days." And so, some priests became interpreters, between doctrine and life, between law and longing. They didn't change the sermons, but they translated them, softened the hard edges, turned thunder into rain. Even bishops sometimes intervened. One wrote in a pastoral letter, "If a man finds joy in his wife, let him thank God for the gift. If she finds joy in him, let her not be ashamed." And yet, official teaching rarely caught up. The sermons continued. The manuals grew heavier, the sins more specific, the rules more layered. Sex remained something to monitor, to confess, to carefully regulate, even when love was real, and consent mutual, and the intentions honest. But people lived with that. They adjusted. They folded their love into the corners of expectation. They gave it other names, called it duty, called it comfort, sometimes called it blessing. Because even when the church preached fire, the people still lit candles. In the medieval world, marriage had little to do with love and everything to do with livestock. Two families would meet. They'd talk. They'd calculate. And if everything aligned, wealth, land, status, fertility, they'd shake hands or nod silently or call over the village priest. And just like that, two strangers became husband and wife. Not because they were soulmates, not because their hearts had chosen each other, but because one family needed a daughter out of the house, and the other needed an extra pair of hands. Sometimes there was a dowry, a gift from the bride's family to the groom's. Sometimes a bride price, payment from the groom's family to the bride's. Sometimes it was land, sometimes goats, sometimes a cart, a barrel of ale, and that one ox that always looked a bit sad. Marriage, in most cases, was not about affection. It was about alignment, of fields, of names, of futures. The church called it a sacrament. The village called it a transaction. For peasants, the arrangement was often practical. You needed a partner to share the work, someone to milk the cow while you fixed the roof, to bake the bread while you sowed the barley. Love might grow, but it wasn't required. A record from Yorkshire in the 14th century mentions a couple who married because both had good boots and no debts. Another union was arranged because the families shared a fence and wanted to save time mending it. There's even a tale of a man marrying a widow not because he loved her, but because she already owned a beehive, and honey was expensive. In noble circles, things were even less romantic. Marriages were chess moves, diplomatic strategies, a way to unite land, seal alliances, or prevent bloodshed. A noble girl might be promised at birth, or younger, sometimes to a boy, sometimes to a man 3 times her age, with gout and a title. She had no say. Neither did he, often. They married because their fathers signed parchment, because one kingdom needed a port, because a cousin had insulted someone at a feast 3 years ago. It was a world where love was expected to come after duty, if it came at all. And yet, people found ways to shape their fates. The church, despite its rules, actually offered one protection: consent. Surprisingly and significantly, a valid Christian marriage required the free consent of both parties. Even peasants, even noble women. They didn't need witnesses, or a priest, or even a ring. Just 2 people saying, "I take you as mine," and meaning it. That made things complicated, because couples could marry in secret without telling their families, without paperwork, without oxen, and sometimes without waiting. These were called clandestine marriages, and they were everywhere. 2 lovers met in a field, swore themselves to each other before God, and were technically married. No dowry, no feasting, no parental blessing. Just promises, whispers, hands joined. The church, for all its power, often had no idea until it was too late. Families, upon hearing the news, were less than pleased. Sometimes the couple was dragged before a bishop, forced to repeat their vows officially. Sometimes the union was annulled. Other times it was accepted, grudgingly, bitterly, and with a great deal of side-eyeing at church. But these secret vows weren't just teenage rebellion. They were, in many cases, the only path to real choice in love. Because arranged marriages could be cold, hard, unforgiving. And people, even medieval people, wanted more. Some wanted kindness, a partner who didn't raise his voice, or who remembered her name, or who didn't smell like damp wool and onions. Others wanted affection, a warm glance at the fire, a shared joke, a night where no one talked about sheep. Still others wanted something they couldn't quite name, but they knew it wasn't waiting at the altar arranged by their uncle. So they ran, or they whispered, or they waited, until the timing, or the law, or the stars aligned. Of course, many marriages were not unhappy, even arranged ones. People made the best of what they had. They learned each other. grew accustomed, laughed, argued, shared burdens, buried children, harvested wheat, and held each other, sometimes, without needing permission. There are surviving letters, not many, but enough, that speak of tenderness. A husband writing to his wife during a trade journey, "I miss the warmth of our bed and the sound of your breath at night." A wife sending prayers for her husband's safe return and tucking in a sprig of lavender so he might smell home again. These were not grand romances, but they were real, and sometimes that was enough. Still, love had rules, and the church made sure to remind people what marriage was for: procreation, not pleasure, not partnership, not personal fulfillment. Which meant that if you were married and couldn't have children, you were suspect, scrutinized, pitied, and sometimes replaced. Infertility was blamed almost exclusively on women, even though the science, such as it was, didn't support that. Women were inspected, examined, accused of witchcraft, or punished for spilling seed through thought or action. One bishop even suggested that women who daydreamed too much during Lent might close the womb with vanity. Husbands, meanwhile, were given simpler diagnoses: too much wine, cold feet, or just God's will. The pressure to reproduce was enormous, because children weren't just blessings. They were laborers, heirs, insurance, and proof that the marriage was working, in both worldly and spiritual terms. So couples tried, and hoped, and when babies didn't come, they prayed harder, and sometimes looked elsewhere. Which brings us to adultery, but we'll leave that for a later scene. Here, in this moment, we're staying with two people newly joined, not because they chose each other, but because their families, their fields, and their fortunes needed alignment. They might be strangers. They might be friends. They might, with luck, become lovers. And in the best cases, they would grow into something quiet and enduring. A glance across a harvest, a hand reaching for another in silence. Two voices humming the same hymn at dusk. Not love as lightning, but love as lantern light. Soft, flickering, enough to get them through the night. Not every medieval love story began at an altar. Some began behind barns, beside streams, or beneath oak trees, under skies full of stars and futures full of uncertainty. Because even in an age of arranged marriages and strict morality, people still met. They still smiled. They still fell into step together after Mass, lingered a little too long at the well, and found excuses to pass by the same door at just the right time of day. And sometimes they made promises. Before parchment, before priests, before dowries and documents, just two people facing each other, joining hands, and saying, "I take you as mine." This was called hand fasting, an ancient tradition, older than churches and court clerks, where a couple would publicly or privately bind themselves together in informal marriage. Sometimes the hands were literally tied with a ribbon, a scarf, a strand of wool. Other times it was symbolic, but the gesture was clear. This was not a flirtation. This was a vow. In parts of medieval Europe, hand fasting was not only common, it was legally recognized. If a couple hand fasted with intent to marry and consummated the union afterward, they were, in the eyes of the church, married. No witnesses required, no priest, no oxen, no banquet, no dowry. Just intent and physical affirmation, which caused complications, because sometimes those vows were made in secret. Two young lovers in love, or perhaps just full of hope, promising themselves to each other by moonlight, and then waking up to a world that did not agree. Families were furious. Priests were skeptical. Neighbors were already whispering. And depending on the local laws, the couple might be forced to either marry formally or face punishment. This wasn't rare. Court records from the 13th and 14th centuries are filled with cases of hand-fasted couples being dragged before bishops or manorial courts. Some were accused of fornication, others of fraud, some simply of loving in the wrong order, desire first, paperwork second. In some cases, the couple denied they'd made a vow. In others, they swore they had and were begging for the church to recognize it. A few brought witnesses. A few brought babies. And once children were involved, the stakes changed. Illegitimacy wasn't just a personal shame. It had legal consequences. Illegitimate children couldn't inherit property, hold certain positions, or claim noble titles. So proving a valid marriage after the fact became a desperate mission. In one case, a woman claimed she had hand-fasted her lover by a stream with no witnesses, but God as their witness. She gave birth months later. He denied it all. The bishop, unconvinced, ordered him to marry her anyway. The record ends there. We don't know if they were happy, only that they were now legal. Hand-fasting could also be temporary. In some regions, especially in Scotland and parts of Scandinavia, a couple might hand-fast for a year and a day, a trial marriage, to see if they suited each other. If they did, they married formally. If not, they parted. And if a child came during that time, well, then a wedding was strongly encouraged. Sometimes gently, sometimes by force. Not all hand-fasted couples made it. Not all meant what they said. Some used the ritual as an excuse, a justification to be close without lasting commitment. And when things fell apart, hearts weren't the only things broken. The church, increasingly alarmed by the informality, began to crack down. By the 12th and 13th centuries, bishops were pushing for all marriages to take place in church, with witnesses, banns read aloud, and priests officiating. But the rule was hard to enforce, especially in rural areas where churches were far, priests were busy, and couples were impatient. So hand-fasting persisted, sometimes romantic, sometimes reckless, sometimes the only option, and the consequences were real, because medieval communities, for all their simplicity, had sharp ears and sharp tongues. A woman seen walking too often with a man, or a couple overheard whispering behind the bakery, or a youth spotted sneaking away from a hayloft at dawn. The rumors would spread, and in some places, gossip was enough to call a couple to court. Even sleeping in the same room could trigger suspicion, or being seen walking home together after dark. One man was fined for lingering in the same pew too often with a young woman of no relation, another for taking the long way home in tandem. Because everyone knew what these things could mean. Everyone had a cousin who handfasted badly, a neighbor who disappeared, a young man who promised marriage and then didn't deliver, which led to another consequence: forced marriages. If a man and woman were caught together, especially if there was evidence, or a confession, or a witness who happened to be standing near the right shrub at the right moment, they might be ordered to marry by the village court, or the priest, or the girl's father, who happened to have a pitchfork and strong feelings about honor. There's a case from Lincolnshire, 1372. Two teenagers handfasted in secret. They were found out, and the boy denied the promise. The girl wept. The priest hesitated. The father intervened, and the wedding happened that weekend. Whether it was a happy one, no one recorded. Of course, not all hush-hush unions ended badly. Some were successful, lasting, cherished. There's a letter from a woman in Flanders, written years after her handfasting, thanking her husband for choosing her not with coin, but with courage. She calls their vow a wild and unblessed beginning, but one that ripened like fruit in the sun. They had no witnesses, no dowry, no feast, but they had a promise, and, as she wrote, that was church enough for me. In the medieval world, a woman's virginity wasn't just a moral concern, it was currency. It could determine her marriage prospects, her family's honor, her future children's legitimacy, and sometimes her life. Because virginity was not just private, it was public property. Every glance, every whisper, every accidental brush of a sleeve was monitored for signs of impropriety. Not because people were cruel, but because they believed something fragile, priceless, and sacred could be lost without even touching. For noble women, the stakes were highest. A daughter of the aristocracy carried not only her own future, but the strategic hopes of her entire house. Her body was a bargaining chip, and virginity was its seal of authenticity. The marriage contract was more than a ceremony, it was a transaction. One side offered land, titles, military alliances, the other a bride, young, fertile, and intact. To prove this, families often staged what they called a bedding ceremony. The newlyweds would be escorted to their bedchamber, sometimes with songs, sometimes with wine, and sometimes with an audience. In some regions, the couple's union was witnessed by members of both families. Not visually, that would have been too much, but by standing nearby, listening, waiting, hoping for proof. That proof came in the form of blood. A white bedsheet was often placed beneath the bride. After the wedding night, it would be inspected, shown to family, sometimes paraded through the streets, as evidence, as triumph, as confirmation that the goods had been delivered, unopened. If there was blood, the girl was praised. If not, questions began. Whispers. accusations, sometimes annulment, sometimes worse. The tragedy, of course, is that blood is not a reliable indicator. Medical knowledge was poor. Many women don't bleed during first intercourse. But the medieval world didn't know or didn't care. So women were punished for biology, for bad timing, for unlucky linens. One noble bride, whose marriage failed due to a lack of evidence, was sent back to her father's house in disgrace. She lived the rest of her life in a convent. No one ever proved she'd done anything wrong. Another woman, after a similar accusation, cut her own thigh with a small knife, stained the sheet, and saved her marriage. There were guides, discreet, whispered guides, that taught brides how to prepare the sheet if nature failed. Animal blood, finger pricks, small cuts, hidden. It was deception, but also survival. And yet, the scrutiny rarely extended to men. A groom was not expected to be pure. He was expected to be capable. He could arrive at the altar with experience, with lovers, even with children, and still be celebrated, maybe even admired. There was no inspection, no stained sheet, no listening at the wall, just a nod and a raised cup. Because in the medieval imagination, male desire was natural, uncontrollable, a force to be directed, but not denied. Female desire, however, was dangerous, tempting, potentially corrupt. It needed walls, rules, locks, which is why so much effort was spent on guarding girls, watching them, chaperoning them, warning them, even inspecting them. Yes, physical inspections occurred, especially among the nobility. Before a betrothal, a midwife or older female relative might be asked to examine a prospective bride to confirm her intactness. We won't describe the methods, only that they were crude, intrusive, and far from reliable. But they were enough for a deal to go through, for peace to be signed, for a war to be prevented, all on the assumption that a girl had never known touch. There were even rituals to protect virginity, charms, prayers, bodily posture. One text advises girls to sit with knees together, always to preserve modesty. Another warns that looking at a man too long can cause internal stirrings that lead to moral ruin. A few went further. Certain saints were invoked to protect girls at night. Some wore charms sewn into their gowns, small bits of scripture, dried herbs, tiny relics of saints known for resisting temptation. And then, of course, there was the chastity belt, which, despite the popular myth, was largely a product of fantasy and later exaggeration. There's little solid evidence that chastity belts were used widely, or at all, in the medieval period. Most examples are from later centuries, or were created as jokes, warnings, or misunderstood medical devices. But the idea of the belt endures because it fits the mood of the time, control disguised as protection. For women without wealth, virginity still mattered, but in a different way. It was part of a reputation economy. A girl with a clean name could marry, could find work, could walk through the market without stares. A girl with rumors had fewer options. And the rumors didn't need to be true. They just had to be repeated. So mothers taught their daughters to be careful, to speak softly, to never be alone with a man, to walk quickly past taverns, to hold their gaze low and their secrets even lower. Which isn't to say women had no power. Only that power came through navigation, subtlety, reading the room and the law. Some women leveraged their purity in negotiations, in courtship, in vows, and some, when caught between punishment and survival, chose the latter. There are records of women falsely claiming to be widows to explain pregnancies, or inventing secret marriages to avoid charges, or, in one case, claiming miraculous conception. The bishop was not amused. Yet through it all, women found ways to love, to live, to carry dignity even through injustice, and occasionally to laugh. One folk song from the period tells of a girl who stains the wedding sheet ahead of time, winks at her cousin, and says, "Let them cheer for cloth. I'll keep my stories to myself." Virginity wasn't just about morality. It was a stage, a performance, a script handed down, often without consent. And those who couldn't or wouldn't play the role paid the price. But in quiet moments, beneath the weight of law and linen, some women found space for their own story, one not written in blood, or declared in contracts, or shown to the village, but whispered to someone they trusted, held in silence, and remembered as theirs alone. There are names you will not find in the official histories. No titles, no wedding records, no family trees, just margins, notes, whispers. The medieval world didn't talk about queer love in the way we do now, not because it didn't exist, but because it wasn't supposed to. And yet, it did. In the silence between verses, in the letters between cloisters, in the stolen glances during evening prayer, love still bloomed. Unexpected, unwritten, unspoken. Monasteries were full of men. Convents were full of women. They lived together, ate together, prayed side by side, slept just a wall away, and over time, bonds formed, some spiritual, some more than that. A monk might find himself lingering in the scriptorium, watching the curve of another's wrist as he inked a gospel. A nun might wait a little longer in the garden, knowing her favorite sister always passed that way at dusk. It wasn't always physical. Often it wasn't, but it was real. There are letters, rare and scattered, written from monk to monk, from nun to nun, that read like psalms of devotion, not lustful, but intimate, tender, deep. One 12th century monk writes, "I feel the light of God through your voice." Another, in reply, "My soul kneels when you smile." Were they just spiritual metaphors? Maybe, but maybe not. Because we also have stories that go further. A monk exiled after being discovered with another. A nun confined for excessive closeness. A priest removed from his post after being seen holding another's hand too long after Vespers. The church had clear teachings. Same-sex intimacy was a sin, a deviation, a temptation to be resisted, confessed, punished. And yet, punishment varied. Some bishops looked the other way. Some issued harsh sentences. Some, quietly, extended grace. A monk caught in love might be sent to a different monastery, assigned more chores, given extra penance, or simply warned. In one case, a prior was told, "Keep your eyes on the altar, not the altar boy." The matter was not recorded again. In noble households, things were more complex. Because intimacy between same-sex companions, especially women, was often overlooked, expected even, as long as it stayed invisible. Two ladies walking arm in arm, braiding each other's hair, whispering behind veils. This was seen as friendship, or sentiment, or nothing at all. But when such friendships deepened, when feelings stirred beyond what society found comfortable, that's when danger crept in. There is a letter from a noblewoman to her lady-in-waiting, written after they were separated by the woman's marriage. She writes, "My husband is kind, but I sleep cold. Your laughter warmed me more than his vows." It's unsigned, unfinished, folded 3 times and hidden in the binding of a prayer book. We only know it because the book survived, and someone, centuries later, found it. In medieval law, male homosexuality was sometimes prosecuted, especially in cities, especially in later centuries. Sodomy laws were vague and severe. The penalty could be flogging, fines, exile, even death. But enforcement was rare, hard to prove, easily silenced. More often, the danger came not from the law, but from shame, from rumors, from exclusion, from knowing you would never be seen as whole if they ever saw who you loved. So queer love went quiet. It learned to survive in symbols, in poems, in the placement of a flower, in a shared hymn book, in the way someone said your name, soft, slow, sacred. Sometimes it lived in stories. The knight and his squire, the virgin who refused all suitors, the 2 saints buried side by side, though they had no family in common. Even the church held strange echoes. Saint Sergius and Saint Bacchus, Roman soldiers and martyrs, often described as lovers in early Christian writings. Their bond was spiritual, but also deeply personal. Icons show them standing together, arms entwined, faces turned inward. Their names became a symbol, whispered by those who needed to believe that love like theirs could last. And sometimes it did. In secret, in silence, but still it endured. A monk writing poetry to another, disguised as a hymn, a widow and her maidservant sharing a home, and never explaining why they remained unmarried. 2 girls who grew up together, never wed, buried beneath the same stone. There were no wedding rings, no church bells, no feast days for what they felt, but there was still love and grief. When one died, the other mourned in private, lit candles, wrote verses, or simply carried the absence like a quiet wound. Some left no trace, no letters, no names, only the shape of a life that never quite fit into the lines it was given. And yet, they were there. In the monasteries, the convents, the workshops, the markets, the castles, the fields, the lovers no one talked about, because they didn't fit, because they didn't marry, because they didn't leave heirs, but mostly because the world refused to write them down. Still, if you listen, you can hear them. In the ink of forgotten pages, in the hush between choir notes, in a flower pressed in a book, in initials carved into a bench beneath the garden wall. They lived, they loved, they were real. Even if no one talked about them, there's a certain image that comes to mind whenever we talk about medieval sex. The chastity belt, cold, iron, locked, symbol of virtue or of cruelty, depending on the storyteller. It appears in cartoons, in museums, in costume dramas. A medieval woman, imprisoned in her own body, while a jealous husband heads off to war with the only key. It's a powerful image, dramatic, memorable, but also probably not real. Historians have searched through court records, letters, sermons, manuals, and wills. And while stories of chastity belts exist, solid evidence of their widespread use in the medieval period is almost non-existent. Most physical examples in museums, Renaissance era, or 19th century fakes, or theatrical props, or misunderstood medical devices. The first written reference to a chastity belt comes from the 15th century, well after the so-called High Medieval period. And even then, it's a joke, a satirical poem mocking overprotective husbands. Not a blueprint. The idea caught on later, especially in the Victorian era, when anxiety about morality, female sexuality, and control found fertile ground. But that says more about the Victorians than it does about the Middle Ages. So where did the myth come from? And what truths, if any, hide beneath it? Because while there may not have been belts of iron, there were still locks, just of a different kind. Surveillance, shame, expectation. These were the tools medieval society used to regulate desire. A noblewoman didn't need a belt. She had watchful servants, gossiping neighbors, and parents who treated her virtue like a stock investment. Peasant girls had their families, their village, their reputations, which could rise or fall on the strength of a rumor. Desire wasn't locked away physically, it was locked away socially. But the idea of a chastity belt appealed to the imagination because it offered something dramatic, symbolic, complete. It turned an abstract fear of infidelity, of female agency, into a literal object. And that's the heart of it. The belt wasn't about protection. It was about control. In many of the stories, the belt is wielded by a man. A knight leaving for the Crusades, worried his wife might stray. He locks her up, hands the key to a loyal servant, rides off, proud and confident. But even in these tales, things rarely go as planned. The servant loses the key, or uses the key, or the woman finds a way to pick the lock. With a hairpin, with a prayer, with persistence. These aren't just stories about fidelity. They're stories about mistrust, about fear, about the fantasy that desire can be engineered out of a person with enough metal and enough willpower. But the medieval world didn't need metal to achieve this. It used words. Girls were told stories about ruined reputations, about shameful deaths, about the fallen who wandered the edges of towns, unmarried, unloved, untouchable. And they listened, because the stories were loud, and the alternatives were silent. Even art reinforced the message. Paintings and woodcuts showed women as vessels of temptation. Snakes coiled at their feet, apples in their hands, demons whispering into their ears. They were told that even their thoughts could betray them, that a daydream could open a door to sin, that a flicker of curiosity might be the first step down a long and slippery slope. So they policed themselves, not because of iron belts, but because of invisible chains. And what of men? Surely they too were taught restraint? Yes, but differently. Male desire was framed as dangerous, yes, but also expected, natural, an unruly dog to be leashed, but never truly tamed. The real concern wasn't whether men desired. It was who they desired, and whether the consequences would embarrass their family or cost them coin. There are stories of women being punished for seducing priests, never mind that the priest initiated it, or that the woman had no real choice. Because sin was often defined by power, and the belt, real or imagined, was never wrapped around the waist of the powerful. There were other myths too, beliefs that shaped how people understood their bodies. Like the idea that a woman who lost her virginity before marriage would never carry a child cleanly, or that sleeping with a man outside marriage would leave a mark, a literal stain on the skin, visible to the trained eye. Midwives were sometimes taught to look for signs: a looseness in the hips, a softness in the gaze, a lack of modesty in movement. None of it scientific, all of it consequential. Some believed a woman's breath would change after she'd known a man, that her voice would deepen, or her dreams would turn more vivid. There were even rituals to reverse such effects: prayers, pilgrimages, herbs steeped in wine. None of them worked, but all of them promised. Control was everything, even when it wasn't real. Because the myth of the chastity belt survived, not because it was common, but because it felt familiar. A metaphor made metal. The idea that if you could just secure someone's body, you could also control their heart. But love doesn't work like that. Neither does desire. They leak through cracks, through rules, through iron. Which is why most medieval women didn't need keys. They needed cleverness. They timed their meetings, chose their allies, read the faces of their chaperones. And sometimes, in moments of great risk, they trusted someone with their story. A friend, a sister, a priest who still remembered what it was to feel. And when the world came knocking, with questions, with suspicions, with shame, they held the lock in place. Not because they believed it, but because they had to. The chastity belt is a myth, But the fear behind it, that was real. The fear of loss, the fear of shame, the fear of freedom, and perhaps the fear that someone, somewhere, might choose love without asking permission first. There was a kind of woman in the medieval world that everyone knew, but no one truly saw. They were called many things: public women, night sisters, daughters of Eve, sinners, survivors. We know them today as sex workers. And in medieval Europe, they lived in the strange space between tolerance and condemnation. Because prostitution wasn't exactly illegal. In many cities, it was licensed, taxed, supervised, sometimes even protected. The logic was simple. Men would seek pleasure, so better to confine that pleasure to specific streets, specific houses, specific women. Better to manage sin than pretend it didn't exist. So towns opened brothels, sometimes run by local councils, sometimes by landlords, occasionally by clergy. Yes, the church often condemned prostitution in sermons, but in practice, it quietly allowed it, even collected rent from brothel districts, turned a blind eye, as long as the business stayed orderly. In 15th century London, for example, the Bishop of Winchester oversaw an area of legal brothels. The women there were called Winchester geese, not out of affection, but because of their location and the noise. They were required to register, to undergo regular health inspections, to avoid working on Sundays and feast days, and to follow a strict list of rules. Some brothels even had operating hours, and curfews, and fines for misbehavior. It wasn't freedom, it was regulation, a business, but only as long as it remained convenient for men in power. So who were these women? Why did they do it? The reasons were as varied as the women themselves. Some were orphans, some were widows, some were daughters whose families could no longer feed them. Some had run from violent homes, some had been sold, and some had simply chosen the work because it paid. And it did pay. Not well, not safely, but better than many other options. A washerwoman might earn a few coins a week, a serving girl even less. A prostitute, depending on location and clientele, could double or triple that in a single night. But the cost? High, always high. These women lived under constant scrutiny, from clients, from officials, from neighbors, from priests who preached against them in daylight and visited by lantern light. They could be fined, beaten, expelled, branded, or simply abandoned when they became ill, pregnant, or too old to bring profit. Some formed small communities. They looked after each other, shared bread, kept watch, buried the ones who didn't make it. There's a record from Bruges of a woman named Johanna who worked in a city-run brothel for 11 years. When she died, it was her fellow workers who lit the candles, not the church, not the men, her sisters. Some women eventually left. If they married or found other work, or simply disappeared. But many remained. Because starting over was hard. Because the past followed them. Because poverty has a long shadow. And still they lived. They sang, laughed, danced on feast days, named their children after saints, kept cats, told stories, fell in love, even if that love was complicated or temporary or never returned. They stitched small things, a ribbon, a scrap of lace, a line of poetry on the inside hem of a sleeve. Their names weren't recorded often, but their presence was everywhere. In tax rolls, in fines, in sudden baptisms, in poems, in gossip. Sometimes they were feared, sometimes desired, rarely respected. And yet, they were essential to the economy, to the social order, to the men who visited, to the church that tolerated them, to the world that pretended not to need them. Their lives were full of contradictions, protected and vulnerable, seen and unseen, holy days off, but no holidays of their own. They lived at the edges of town, at the edges of law, at the edges of history, and sometimes in the edge of a poem, you can still hear them. A ballad from 14th century France tells of a girl named Isabeau whose lover was killed in war. She took up the trade to survive, but she lit a candle for him every night and gave half her earnings to the poor. The song ends not in shame, but in quiet blessing. Her bed was sold, but not her soul. In the end, these women were neither saints nor villains. They were simply people doing what they had to, in a world that gave them few choices and even fewer second chances. They lived where no one wanted to look, but they looked after each other. And in the silence of the brothel, when the last door had closed, somewhere between exhaustion and prayer, they might have whispered each other's real names. Let's start with a simple question. What did people smell like in the Middle Ages? Not the romanticized version, not the courtly perfumes and flower crowns of storybooks, but the real people, the ones doing laundry by hand, hauling buckets, sleeping 5 to a room. The answer is complicated, because the Middle Ages didn't just smell bad, it smelled busy. Wood smoke, boiled cabbage, tanned leather, horse dung, ale, rain-soaked wool. And under all that, people, not necessarily foul, just human, sweaty, earthy, alive. We imagine the medieval world as a time without hygiene, but that's not quite true. People did bathe, just not the way we do. Not every day, not always alone, not with strawberry-scented shampoo. Bathing was tied to class, region, and season. In cities, public bathhouses were common, social spaces where men and women gathered to clean, relax, and, occasionally, flirt. Yes, bathhouses had a reputation. Some deserved, some exaggerated. But at their core, they were about warmth and water, two luxuries in a cold, wooden world. The bathhouses were sometimes run by towns, other times by private keepers. They offered tubs, steam rooms, and services like hair washing, shaving, and herbal scrubs. Water was perfumed with lavender, rosemary, chamomile, or bay leaves, sometimes mint, sometimes rose. Not just for beauty, but to cover the fact that the water had already been used several times. Towels were shared, so were tubs, and sometimes so were beds in the upstairs rooms. Because cleanliness and intimacy were often linked, many romantic encounters began after a shared bath. Soft skin, warm bodies, steam curling around the candlelight. But not everyone had access to this. Bathhouses cost money, and in the countryside, you made do with a basin, a stream, or a bucket heated over the fire. Rural families bathed when they could, maybe once a week, maybe less in winter. Children first, then elders, then adults, then the water was dumped or saved for laundry. Soap existed, usually made from animal fat and ashes. It was rough, gray, and sometimes burned if you got it in your eyes. But it worked, mostly. Perfume was for the rich, but even they used it carefully. Dabbed on wrists, mixed with vinegar, hung in sachets inside gowns. Never sprayed, never wasted. Scent wasn't just cosmetic, it was symbolic. A sweet-smelling body meant a clean soul. A foul odor, a sign of sin, or sickness, or demonic possession. Priests wrote sermons about the smell of virtue. Confessors asked if you washed too often, not because of hygiene, but because bathing was seen as sensual. Too much pleasure, too much skin, too much potential temptation. So many walked a fine line, wanting to be clean, but not vain, pure, but not provocative. Some saints refused to bathe at all, not out of poverty, but out of piety. The body was seen as a vessel of temptation. Better to keep it uncomfortable, smelly, mortified. But for ordinary people, smell was part of life. It told you where you were, who was near, what season it was, who had come in from the fields, and who was courting. Yes, smell mattered in romance, very much. A clean tunic, oiled hair, a sprig of herbs tucked into a belt, a clove of garlic chewed before kissing to ward off sickness, not lovers, though it sometimes did both. A man might bring his girl a posy, not just as a gift, but as a polite hint. A woman might crush rosemary into her neckline before walking past the blacksmith's, just in case. Homes praised not just beauty, but fragrance. Breath like apples, hair like spices, skin like warmed milk. Even if none of it was true, even if most smelled like people. There were remedies for bad breath, for body odor, for armpit devils. Yes, that's a real phrase. It involved applying sage and alum under the arms. Sometimes wine, sometimes vinegar. And if that failed, you prayed, or pretended not to notice. Because the truth was, everyone had a scent. Everyone lived close. Shared beds, shared air, shared wool in winter and sweat in summer. You learn to love someone's smell, or to endure it, or to match it with your own, like a rhythm, like a tune, like a home. There's a quiet kind of romance in that. Two people who don't expect roses, but know the difference between wood smoke and barley on each other's skin. Who lean in close, not for perfume, but for presence. Who find comfort in the familiar, even if it's dusty, even if it's human. Because scent isn't just about attraction, it's about memory. A mother's shawl, a lover's pillow, the lingering smell of someone who's gone, but not forgotten. The Middle Ages didn't smell like soap, or lilacs, or lemon. It smelled like people, trying, living, loving.